the next panel is focused again on third parties. So one of the major issues that we see as we talk to companies are challenges stemming from the third parties. You heard that in the last session. You'll hear more about it in this session. So our moderator, who is not in the guidebook, but we're very happy you're able to make it, and I think we've got a slide for you, is Tristan Grimmer, who's a partner at Baker McKenzie. We've also got Nicola Mullet from Ernst & Young, Svatava Sprague from Microsoft, and Yim Woodman from Cummins. I promised I would show a couple data points. I'll do those very quickly. You'll see on the slide, so 56% of world's most ethical companies from 2019 conduct due diligence on third parties at least every 3 years. 64% of world's most ethical companies provide third parties directly with ethics and compliance assisting or training. And that's a trend line that we see increasing. So that's something that if your organizations are not doing, you may want to think about. And again, if you want more resources on that and you are a Bella member, companies like Coca-Cola, GE, Cummins have all done that. So with that, maybe Tristan, I'll hand it over to you if you'd like to kick it off and introduce the panel.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds like it's on. Good morning, everybody. So, as was just mentioned, my name is Tristan Grimmer. I'm a partner with the global law firm Baker McKenzie, based in the London office of Baker's, where I principally spend my time split between compliance and investigatory work, both in the ABC space and also in the trade sanctions space. So two of the key corporate compliance risks that you will wrestle with on a day-to-day basis. And as sort of noted, this panel session is going to be focusing on third-party risk management and thinking about how we achieve best practice in that space globally. Before I let the esteemed panel members introduce themselves, I'm just going to say a few introductory words about what we see in terms of where this space is moving, and our take on the challenges that corporates are facing in trying to manage third-party risk. I think we all know from the oft-repeated statistics that you'll get in any FCPA presentation that you'll have received around the inherent risks that lie in your third-party relationships that you have as part of your supply chain ecosystem. The reality, of course, is that from an ABC perspective, those risks are very true. They're not made up. They are reflected in statistics. They're reflected in your day-to-day lives. And whilst we look at the pipeline of the cases, for example, that the Serious Fraud Office is currently dealing with here in the UK, it's also reflected there. So if you look at that pipeline of cases, currently heavily focused around, in particular, the Unioil case and the related corporates that were using that effective super agent. We see that focus there. We see the focus in the other press releases, even when very short. They, in all cases, refer to some degree of third-party involvement. And of course, the expectations from a regulator standpoint, and of course there are many other stakeholders you're playing to here, but from a regulatory standpoint, the bar isn't being lowered. If you look at your most recent guidance from DOJ, as they continue to adopt the FCPA guidance and spread it across into their broader guidance on evaluating corporate compliance programs, third-party risk management sits at the center of much of that guidance. Now, I guess I come to this making an assumption, and hopefully the assumption is correct, which is that all of you will have some degree of third-party program sitting inside your organization. For some of you, that will be purely focused on ABC risk, perhaps. For others, it will be developing into something else. So what we wanted to use this panel to focus on is really how we all refining our tools and approaches in managing that third-party risk from an anti-bribery standpoint, but also how are we reacting to this trend which is seeing the need for management into other risk areas beyond ABC, and how we can effectively rise to that challenge. And that stretches into a number of different questions in terms of the different legal risk areas and the other asks you're getting from your other stakeholders about protecting the value and reputation of your organizations. So those were really the introductory words I wanted to share, and then I wanted to hand over to this very esteemed panel, starting with Yim, I think, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves, because you all have different backgrounds and different organizations.
Sure. So, good morning, everyone. So, my name is Yim Woodman. So, I'm working for Cummins, and just for a little bit of a brief introduction for Cummins, we are manufacturing and selling diesel and natural gas engines, generators, and also all the parts like filters and turbochargers around the world. So, we have the presence around the globe. We have around 62,000 employees. Our turnover last year was around just under $24 billion. We have the compliance program independently with a separate function within the U.S. It's a U.S.-based company, so we have the headquarters in Columbus, Indiana. For a little bit of background about myself, I'm actually with Cummins for a long time, and I have quite a different background actually in commercial. So I have economics bachelor and also a marketing master degree. So I joined Cummins with the different roles that I have performed within the company. So I have been with marketing strategy team, distribution development team, channel management team, and 3 years ago I have been recruited into ethics and compliance mainly to develop the third-party compliance program. And it's more or less a natural transformation for me because I really already working with the third parties, working directly with independent distributors, managing their performance, managing the business plan. So going into this role, I bring a lot of knowledge and how to interact with the business side of the third parties, and also at the same time bringing the knowledge of the third party back into the ethics and compliance function so that we can actually integrate the two together.
Hello, my name is Nicola Mollett. I am a senior manager at EY. I work in the Forensic and Integrity Services group. And what I talk to my clients about, what they come to me for, is really to understand the risks of the different people and organizations that they work with, and then help develop strategies on how we're going to manage and mitigate this risk. So I work with a whole range of clients, from kind of small UK mid-sized companies who are just starting out on a third-party compliance journey to established multinational companies who have enormous compliance frameworks, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. And I guess one of the interesting things that I'm seeing with the clients that I'm talking to is slowly a shift away from a pure focus on, regulatory drivers and looking at risks in isolation to a more holistic approach, which also thinks about brand protection and creating value for the business from the immense amounts of data that you've collected as a compliance function. So hopefully we'll get into some of these themes as we talk today.
Thank you. My name is Svatova Sprake. I'm at Microsoft. I am a lawyer by the background, by profession, and I'm part of a Microsoft legal function, but my role is to act as a subject matter expert on compliance, particularly anti-corruption and related issues in Western Europe. And in that context, I interact with a whole range of stakeholders in the region on compliance topics, including handling third-party issues, which of course are enormous and large in scale, but on the other side, also overseeing internal investigations in the region.
All right, thanks all. So as you can see, we've got some quite different perspectives on the panel, which hopefully we can make the most use of as we go through. So I guess the first question, I think, and it always is the starting point for any journey around third parties, is really defining what we mean by that. I think if we all go back in 5-10 years, I think there was always probably quite a narrow view of what we meant by third parties in terms of that environment we were trying to manage. But maybe, Sadova, if you could start with a few remarks on where you see that dialogue progressing inside Microsoft in terms of the third-party risk that you're trying to manage, and whether that's now extending beyond what traditionally would have been seen as sort of third-party risk in terms of agents, distributors. Is that now moving off into other directions?
I think you listed pretty much all, but essentially, yes, given my background, certainly prior to Microsoft, of course, suppliers or services were traditionally the main focus on compliance programs, and particularly in the context of anti-corruption. At Microsoft, we have a whole range of parties, so not only those who provide services to us, but also those to whom we sell. And that's, you touched on the topic of distributors, who obviously also represent a risk from a whole range of aspects. So I think we mainly categorize the third parties into those two big buckets, I would say, and each bucket will then have a whole range of subsets and subcategories, and both in terms of what they're doing, but also both in terms of the size of how extensive our dealings with them might be. And I think that's probably the kind of the good starting point, and maybe I might hand it over to you for...
Sure. So I guess I have a typical consultant answer, which is that in my opinion, third parties are actually quite a broad category. So fundamentally, they are anyone that you're doing business with who is not employed by your organization. And I think getting your arms around what that actually means as an organization isn't the simplest thing. A lot of the clients I work with, when you ask them, well, how many third parties do you work with? It's a bit of a head scratcher. Data sits in different countries, in different systems, maybe in someone's filing cabinet somewhere. And so actually one of the first things that we try to do with clients is say, let's shake open all the cabinets, let's find out where all the third parties sit. And then let's start trying to understand, well, what different categories do we have? How can we segment them? Do they all need to be in scope? And then we have those conversations then. But I think actually figuring out who are my third parties, and they're always going to be different categories depending on the organization that you are.
Yeah, I think my answers would be similar to Svetova in terms of how we see the third parties in Cummins, because with the different market segments and the route to market that we have around the globe, because we're operating in so many broad segments like oil and gas, marine, mining, telecommunication, infrastructure, etc. So having someone independent representing us in the local markets are very important to us. So in terms of how we see the third parties, those are the entities that we have the commercial relationship with. So we can talk about independent distributors, independent dealers, joint ventures, sales agents, and also, like you said here, we're also looking at suppliers who are also providing services and products to us as well. We have the direct suppliers who are actually supplying all the raw materials that go into our products, and also our indirect suppliers who are providing the different services like cleaning or security or consultancy. So those are also, for us, are the third parties.
Thanks. And I think that's certainly what we see when we have conversations with clients in this space, is that there is now this desire to look out more broadly into where other risks may be arising. And I think that's primarily being driven by a concern, well, I think two things really. One, a concern that things are mislabeled and misunderstood, and therefore if you think about these definitions too narrowly, you will often miss high-risk relationships. And I think the other piece is, and some of the comments that were made on the panel, is around the different drivers here. So not all of this is being driven by pure exposure legal risk. A lot of this is around preservation of value, preservation of reputation, but some of the different legal risk areas which we're seeing emerging as well. So there are a number of different factors at play here. So obviously with that huge population of third parties, ever increasing population of third parties, at least in terms of types that we're seeing, I guess the next logical question is about how you're all measuring risk within that population. I'm again assuming, of course, that everybody in the room is quite familiar with the tools that would be used to measure that risk from a pure ABC perspective. But I'm interested in terms of what your current approach is for sort of triaging down into identifying those higher risk relationships currently.
From Microsoft perspective, given the vast population of parties we deal with, we've had to go through an assessment of how to prioritize and narrow down those that we need to look into further, and do how the levels of due diligence that we conduct. Those we consider based on a whole range of factors as those to concentrate on are essentially those that do business dealings with us, as you said, that relate to our core business. So those distributors, as you mentioned, through whom we sell to ultimately to end customers. So the what we call channel partners, the resellers who will purchase licenses and related services from us and sell them on to customers or further distributors. And on the other hand, of course, with the increase of focus on cloud technology, and we as a company provide increasing services as well relating to licenses, not only the products or licensing themselves. We of course engage and work. Our partners are working with us as well in providing services, the related services relating to cloud. So these would be the two main categories that then we have to look at more carefully and see how we are going to prioritize amongst those. We had recently, in terms of the scale of this population that I just described, they amounted to around 250,000. So you can imagine that, of course, we can't apply the same standard to all of those parties and have to further prioritize. But essentially, this ecosystem is subject to what we could consider our enhanced due diligence, which in itself is then differentiates depending on various factors. Of course, we will split them into low, medium, high risk, and the process will then work through different approaches depending on which category they fall into.
Thanks, that's interesting. And Yim, what are you looking at in that regard?
Yeah, sure. So similar to how we look at our third parties, we look at the relationship that we have with that specific entities. For example, we know that our independent distributors are probably the one that we would like to concentrate, basically because they are acting on behalf of us. They're selling our products and they are servicing the products on behalf of Cummins. So the way that we look at how to prioritize those independent distributors or dealers really about what are the roles and responsibilities that they're providing to Cummins. Basically, if you compare one distributor that actually representing all the business line with Cummins, representing more than 1 or 2 countries in the high-risk area, and also servicing all the products with the to the customers, those are probably, would give more higher risk compared to our dealers who are actually repairing the engines. So those are the criteria that we look at primarily. And also we look at locations and, the business market segments that they are in as well. But basically the relationship and also responsibilities of those partners that we have.
Okay, and so I guess, one of the challenges I'm interested in is that when you look at this through maybe one legal risk area, so if we look at this through the anti-bribery and corruption risk area, as you were just outlining, that there are a set of questions you can ask yourself to get to a position where you can categorize as higher, medium, lower within that particular risk area. I guess, Sada, what I'm interested in your remarks is that it would seem in those two groups of third parties you spoke about, on the one hand your channel partners who are promoting the sale of your products, and on the other hand your key partners around your cloud services, they feel like quite different risks that you're trying to manage in one respect. And so I'm interested in whether or not you are are you applying different criteria within those different buckets in terms of how you're assessing the risk?
We went through a process of consolidation, given the changing ecosystem in our partner structure, and given the vast, the different activities, essentially, as you described, they engage in. And we went through a process of consolidation. So the aim is actually to be as consistent as possible. We're using technology, as a tech company, of course, and my colleague Alan Gibson will be talking later on about that exciting topic further. But essentially, we are applying our own internal resources in terms of technology, data analytics, to take into account a whole range of factors. So, but I think ultimately there will be essentially the standard type of what you can see in the factors that you take into account in any risk. So starting with financial background of these third parties, the kind of activities they engage in, what kind of sectors they engage in, do they deal with public sector, what kind of size of business they handle, and that can be that can be a factor that can talk to a broader range of risks rather than purely also which jurisdictions they operate in, and that can be then a useful factor that is applied towards a broader range of risks, not only anti-corruption but also trade and sanctions and further risks that we've discussed earlier.
And Yim, is that the same for you, that you're getting to a point now where you feel you're measuring risk and applying that across a broader group of risk areas on a consistent basis rather than doing it for each individual risk area?
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging activities that we are doing. But of course, with the third parties type that we have, anti-bribery is still the main focus, basically, because all the market segments that we are operating is heavily involved state-owned entities. So on top of that, we also have the risk of trade sanctions because we are an American company. So we want to make sure that within our assessment, we always ask our third parties, where do you export? Do you work heavily with state-owned entities? What are the percentage of your sales contribute to state-owned entities? So those are the compulsory questions that we actually ask our third parties. But on top of that, you're also seeing the trend of money laundering, tax evasion, modern slavery for suppliers, for example. So we also, on the other side, we are trying to educate our business functions in terms of know your customers, making sure that we are able to notice the red flags that our third parties bringing internally, and then they would be able to feed that back to us, and then we will work with the third parties in terms of putting in place the mitigation plan.
And Nicola, in terms of what clients are coming to you and the challenge that they're putting in front of you, is that what you're seeing, that people are coming to you and saying, don't just sell us something that just measures risk for an ABC perspective? Are you seeing that question being asked on a far broader basis now?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess, broadly speaking, we have two different buckets of clients. So some who are just starting out on this kind of journey, and some who are, like you guys, much more further down the path, and you've got a much clearer view of what kind of risks you're looking at and what your population looks like. So I'm working with a client at the moment, is a shipping client, and for them, third-party due diligence is very new. And so working with them to really hone in on what the risks are, and we start from a perspective of, well, what do they do for you? How do they do it? Are they interacting with government officials? And it's talking to people in the business to get that actual hands-on insight rather than kind of building some kind of program in like a compliance vacuum. So leveraging the kind of insight that they have to say, what are they doing? What are the touch points? What are you worried about? Are you worried? To really inform a risk assessment process. And as far as is possible, we want to try and capture as many risks as we can within one process so that we're not duplicating effort. And in some ways, I guess if you're starting out on this kind of program now, it's a good time because the big companies have already done it. They've already done it where they treat 15 risks in isolation and have realized that's actually not very efficient. So in a way, you're an advantage that you can benefit from all those learnings. And yeah, I mean, in terms of more established clients, we are seeing now that, they've built very extensive, very robust programs which take into account lots of different risks. And they're now asking the question, okay, how do I simplify? I feel like I've got good coverage now, but am I actually doing too much? How can I do less? And when I'm talking to those clients, I'm talking about integration, so bringing risks together so that we can tackle it in one process. Automation, can technology be doing some of the legwork for you? And I think the third thing there is value creation. So you've annoyed everyone in the business, you've asked them hundreds of questions, you've collected an enormous amount of data. How are you going to use that data now to add value back into your business? So I think it's quite an exciting opportunity and quite an exciting position to be in. You've kind of done the hard work coming up the hill of covering off your risk base, and now you can start generating value back and move away from being seen as being a cost. within the organization.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, that certainly resonates. So at Microsoft, we're seeing what I think is really exciting synergy between what is the traditional compliance function trying to achieve and what our business as a whole is working towards. So the Microsoft mission is to empower every person and organization in the world to achieve more, and underlying under that is the concept of trust. We want to inspire trust amongst the customers and partners and stakeholders, shareholders, and so on. And on the back of that, then we have the notion of trust is underpinning the whole compliance program that goes beyond the third parties, but also in the context of the third parties then, it's also about trust. Can we trust the stakeholders, the parties we are working with, but we also have expectations from on our own employees to essentially make sure that they know your counterparty, the business partner, and then they give us their insights as to what they learned, what they hear in terms of business. So thank you. I think that was just a very important point to make.
Yeah, just to add on that one, because I think the integration to the business is very, very important, because they are the front line. They're interacting with the customer, with third parties every single day. They know a lot more than us. So having them to be able to notice the red flags and feed that back to us is really important. And also, the more you can integrate our compliance process into their business process, it's also making their life easier as well.
And of course, it all makes complete sense, doesn't it? Because one of the starting points of any one of these programs is actually rationalizing the business need for that third party, and that's the ongoing question you want to be asking your business colleagues around justification for why they're adding value to the business. And of course, if you can leverage the information that comes through those compliance processes to business ends, then that's absolutely generating value in the truest sense of the word. I guess one of the sort of the other side of that, and again, it depends on where different people are in their journey, that we see the fight with the business is around that initial rationalization process of saying, well, look, we're just carrying too much risk by virtue of the fact that we have got an unnecessary amount of third parties held within our organization. And maybe you could comment first. I'm just interested in how far you are down the route of saying, right, you're currently using, 35 third parties in China. We want there to be 5 moving forward. How far are you down that journey? And maybe you could share some thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because there are certain type of third parties that we obviously discourage within our organization. For example, sales agents or finders. We strongly discourage that, basically because the way they were incentivized and getting money or bringing the business to Cummins. We have a very strict process in terms of how we want to appoint. You need to make the business case. You have to go to the top level approval. In terms of getting that sales agent appointed, but basically saying that with the independent distributors and the dealers that we have around the globe, the numbers actually keep increasing, basically because they're an expert in the areas. But what we're trying to do more is really to have more visibility and to have more controls and to have more buy-in from the third parties in terms of how they see the compliance risk and how they can work with us to acknowledge that risk and mitigate those risks.
Nicola, is that something clients come to you to ask, sort of help to answer that question in terms of how can we reduce those third parties down, and can you help us with analytics, basically, I guess, to the answers of some of those questions?
Yeah, I think that is something we're seeing, and I guess it links back to that, one of the first questions I posed around, well, who are your third parties and how many are there? I think getting clarity of that is the start of that process, because often you might not know that you've got 10 people all providing the same service for you, and then you can have a meaningful conversation with the business as to, well, do you need 10? Why are you getting a better deal from this one and not this one? And we use that kind of insight when we're looking at proactive monitoring as well. So you've collected all this data, you can look at a lot about the different commercial terms that are being offered, how you're interacting with them, and you can use analytics then to drill down into that data and say, well, does that make sense? And I guess this is getting into the adding value piece around, from a compliance perspective, we care because, we know that unusual commercial terms can be a red flag that something isn't right. But from the business perspective as well, if we're giving them that information, maybe they didn't realize. I mean, I was working with a client last year in Russia and looking at some of the commercial terms in their business, and they're giving their distributors discounts for paying within 30 days or buying a certain volume. But then in the end, the distributors aren't actually meeting those commercial terms, so they're giving away money from their business because no one's closely monitoring, well, actually, are they doing what they said they were going to do? So we can feed all this information back into this rationalization process, and we can feed it back into our risk assessment saying, we know we get value from X, we don't get value from Y, so let's cut that out. Let's change how we structure the business with those kinds of providers. We know that these things are red flags, so we're going to stop offering those kind of commercial terms in our business. So it's like a loop, isn't it? So your monitoring is going to feed back in and inform your risk assessment. And I think if you can make commercial sense to the business as to why you're asking the questions, then I think, you're winning. If you can show them how it's going to make their lives better and their lives easier, then that's great.
Yeah, I was just add to that. So the question you ask is more of a standard approach when it comes to managing your supply chain. So that's when typically we see the need for rationalization and maybe narrowing down. And at Microsoft, we sort of make, one of the key requirements as part of onboarding of any new supplier is the question of what is the business justification and could any of the existing supplier not provide the same service. And that's one of the key barriers, so to speak, that anybody who wants to bring somebody new in they have to overcome. On the other side, in terms of the ecosystem of partners for whom we sell our products, we operate in over 120 countries. We do need many of them still. So it's not so much a matter of narrowing down, but rather making sure that we work with good quality partners who have the required technical skills and qualifications that we need to support our products and to serve best our end customers.
And I think that, and it's an obvious point, but I'll make it nonetheless. I mean, I think what that shows is the reality that these things are still very industry driven. If you were to go to any number of aerospace players, for example, they would probably be in a very different space, which is that we don't want to see any agents or distributors in this business at all, frankly, anymore. So I do think it's always right to reflect that. Just because you hear that metric from a different industry doesn't mean that's the way of effectively managing the risk in your particular space, particularly when the businesses are so completely different. So we've spoken a bit about trying to work out where your higher risk relationships are. Let's move on just to talk about how you apply your due diligence and other tools against that framework. One way of looking at the question I'm going to ask you is around how do you decide when to go to those further steps about enhanced diligence. But I'm actually commonly finding that for clients it's fighting back the question the other way, which is how do you avoid getting to a position where you're implying enhanced diligence for everybody, that it becomes the new normal. And so again, I'm interested in thoughts from the panel about how you're applying rigor to that process so that you've got confidence about the risk-based decisions that you're making. I don't know who would like to start.
I mean, that to me, what you said then, how do we avoid getting to a position where we have to do enhanced diligence? So I guess my question back to my client would be, well, why do you want to avoid being in that position? And the two things I tend to hear is, well, one, it creates too much work for me. If I have to do enhanced due diligence, there's this huge list of things I have to do. And two, once I've done the work, it generates a whole bunch of red flags and information that they then have to make a decision about. So I think if we start thinking about, well, if we can leverage those other things we talked about earlier around automation, how much of that legwork can we automate so that it runs seamlessly in the background? How much can we move towards more of an ongoing monitoring so you're not kind of doing the traditional approach of initiate my due diligence desktop research every 3 years because it's low risk, 2 years because it's medium, every year because it's high. We move away from that. We use technology to monitor our risks in the background, and then we can focus our attention on what's coming out of that process. And then in terms of having too much information to review, we can use technology again to try and whittle that down to what's really important. You know, I think a bugbear of a lot of people is a number of, I don't know, false positives you get when you're doing watch list screening. But we've made huge leaps and bounds in technology now, which you can really use computers to do a lot of that work for you, freeing you up to then think about, well, what does it mean that there's presence of red flag X, you know, this person is a PEP. You can then think about, well, what does that actually mean? Is it going to impact on how I do business with them? Is it going to mean that I want to have, you know, an audit clause, an ABAC clause, whatever it's going to be? I think taking some of the legwork out of enhanced due diligence so that the actions you are taking are the ones that add the most value is as crucial as, you know, reducing the population that's subjected to that.
So I think the way that we apply enhanced due diligence is more applied towards the higher risk third-party categories. So we would think about, you know, independent distributors. We applied enhanced due diligence to all of them. So hundreds of enhanced due diligence that we have globally, more than 90% now have gone through enhanced due diligence. And it doesn't mean that we're going to do it every year. You know, it's really based on the results of the enhanced due diligence that we know and mitigation plan that we have put in place. And some of them we actually end up terminating because of that. And it's very strict. You know, we are following the guidelines and we following the result very seriously. And we communicating to the business partners that, you know, this is the way that we operating. So, but in the other category where, you know, for example, dealers or suppliers where we see it as a lower risk for Cummins, we do online screening. And that applied across the board. But the way we do it, when we notice the red flags that we see as serious, then we might make a decision to actually put them through enhanced due diligence as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the answers so far show that it's a relative expression almost. What do you mean by enhanced diligence? I think your question kind of led to that, right? Because I think what we do now is almost, you know, I don't know, we use third-party providers of detailed due diligence programs, which will do all the things that you've mentioned. But on the back of that, then, depending on the category of the third party, if we go further, we use insights from the monitoring of the day-to-day transactions of the third party. So when it comes to you know, monitoring of the services that they're providing, the quality of proof of execution, if direct flags coming out of these transactions, that's fed back into the cycle of regular annual vetting process that we conduct. And then in addition to that, we have some of the partners or situations that require further attention will then be discussed by the relevant business, finance, legal, compliance stakeholders at a subsidiary or regional level. So there's various degrees of enhanced due diligence, but I think it very much depends on what each party generates, so to speak, and the data and information is growing in terms of what we can collect about them.
Yeah, and that feeds into an observation, and it's nothing more than that. It's an observation without any solution, which is, of course, as a corporate community, as you show your ability to do more, of course, the goalposts move, right? So, and this is always the struggle around, I guess, trying to stay mid-pack or whatever your philosophy might be on these things, because the more agencies and regulators see an ability to detect this or that, the more the goalposts move in terms of the criticism of your failure to follow through in that particular instance. And of course, that's an ever-changing picture, and one we all have to be aware of. I think one of the sort of other interesting points then is really just to test. We spoke about quite an integrated approach in terms of assessing the risk of our population of third parties, and it sounds like you're all respectively, Nicola, you're seeing clients start to go down that journey of undertaking a risk assessment that tries to capture at least all of the financial crime or sanctions-related risk together in one bundle. Looking at it from the diligence side, are you also effectively streamlining procedures so that people are being reviewed, and you're saying that third party has now been reviewed for the purposes of managing ABC, AML, Criminal Finance Act, sanctions risk? Is that the output of your processes now? Is that where you're getting to?
I think it all stems from how I started to define that where we do the enhanced due diligence is focuses on the parties that we do business with. So we want to know everything about them, whether it's the risk from a corruption perspective or any other indications that we pick up in the process that go to integrity. Really, we don't want to deal with people or suppliers and partners who don't share our values of integrity, and integrity is then part of all these other broad categories, compliance with any other laws. So I think it's broader concept than just ABC.
Yeah, I think it goes into monitoring phase and how do you actually managing the results that you already have from the enhanced due diligence or the due diligence screening that you have. And so making sure that once you know that risk, you work on a mitigation plan and you integrate that results into the business reviews or with the procedures that the company has, making sure that it's not being left aside. So that's one thing. Another thing is to make sure that whatever changes within your third parties, you are aware as part of maybe the business reviews or the contract reviews. When you do the renewals of the agreement with your third parties, then we need to make sure that we capture that change. And so that you're not actually done your due diligence 2 years ago and then that's it. You see no risk and you stop doing that. So it's like a continuing approach, making sure that you capture the changes all the time.
And that fits into some of those questions about the ongoing monitoring piece, and something we picked up on earlier in the conversation about generating value for both the compliance side of the organisation and the business side of the organisation. Svatova, is that something in terms of what are the key, I guess, in terms of the top 2 or 3 things that you've done as an organisation to improve your ongoing monitoring of your third parties? What are those areas that you've been focusing in on in terms of monitoring those relationships once they've been through the diligence process, once they're being used by you?
Sure. So I think I already touched on it very briefly. So the life cycle of our the main core partners, so to speak, is essentially onboarding when they enter the ecosystem. And then there is an ongoing monitoring, which takes a number of forms. It's closely linked to the business cycle of renewing the contract and business relationship with those parties. So in order for their contracts to be renewed, the partners have to go through annual vetting process. And it is highly automated in leveraging a lot of the technology that we have. On top of that, we are supplementing this monitoring through the additional controls and processes we have as a company, including internal audit, which is primarily internal facing, as the label says, but also will pick up on issues that involve third parties. We've also established recently specialized partner audit function, so essentially going on a regular basis and selecting third parties and particularly partners for an audit as part of which we exercise our audit rights in our contractual agreements and ask them to show to us that they are complying with these certain requirements we have in our contracts that go to compliance, such as that they in terms of the public sector, for example, we have an increased focus on transparency around discounts we're providing for the benefit of the end customer. So we go and check that the partners did actually pass the full benefit of the discount we awarded for a deal for the customer. And that goes to, not only business sense, but also, acts as a mitigation risk in terms of corruption. So we are doing, we are essentially trying to be proactive in terms of capturing misconduct or risk behavior that we consider undesirable and risky. So there's a number of processes that then fit together and are fed back into the annual vetting process. And I think the other thing that we're doing is obviously, as I mentioned earlier, using our technology, know-how and data analytics to bring the value and to make that process smoother and more insightful for the business.
Yeah, very similar to what you said, and I also already mentioned it briefly in terms of integrating compliance due diligence screening into renewal process, making sure that we vet them all the time, as part of their contract reviews. Also, the database that we use in terms of the screening also help detect the red flags automatically as well, because it actually runs on a regular basis. So even though we screen it today and we do not see any red flags coming up, maybe in the next week or two, we might receive notification saying that there are some red flags that you need to review. So that is also, that's what we build as part of the ongoing or monitoring phase of the due diligence as well. And of course, encouraging and educating the business partners, our business commercial team, to be aware of all these red flags, and also making sure that we have a regular communication, reminding them of the mitigation plan, reminding them of the core values and also importance of compliance, ensuring that they mention these topics, talking about compliance risk with distributors and dealers on an ongoing basis whenever they can is very important. For example, last month, we just had a big conference with our dealers and distributors, and we have the business leader, coming on the stage and talking purely about compliance. What are the risks, anti-bribery, export control, and what are the tools that we have, and what are the support that we need from them. So it's more powerful for them to hear from our business leader rather than having me talking about it.
Yeah, and that theme of balance between the gatekeepers, as it were, and the business is obviously an important theme. And those are some really nice insights, Jim, as well, in terms of things that are being effective for you. Svatsvara, anything from the Microsoft perspective that you would like to share in terms of achieving that balance between the business and compliance legal in terms of this working effectively?
Right. No, I would very much support what you said. We also want to emphasize, and we're very much working on building, collaborating with our business function, and it's much more powerful if they incorporate the emphasis on compliance in their business day-to-day dealings. And that is happening. It is, however, also important that we give them the subject matter expertise support in the cases where, for example, there is a situation that's a bit more complicated and it requires a compliance legal professional to handle that. So we pull in the expertise from all internal functions if and when required, and setting of the processes that deal with the ongoing monitoring and vetting of the partners are of course set, so that there is checks and balances in place, so that the business provide input, but also there is a check from the compliance function to verify that there is nothing else that's going on, or finance provided input. So it is a fragile balance, so to speak. But generally speaking, it works best if the ownership rests with the business, and they are the ultimate risk holders and decision makers when it comes to, should we vet this partner, should we offboard them, and so on.
One last question before I see if there's any other questions in the audience. I guess part of that, and you've both referred to this, is around sometimes it's just about the integrity or perceived reputation of the third party and making a decision around whether there's somebody you want to be working with, i.e. there's no identifiable clear legal risk, this is just pure reputation brand risk for you. How are you making those decisions? Are you pushing that wholly back to the business, or are you setting up committees to assess those sorts of risks? Just sort of interested in that as a question.
I think it's very case-by-case basis. Depends on the risk and how important third parties are. Most of the time, we end up having legal, compliance, business heads together in one room or on the call, trying to understand the background, and then we're representing the result of the due diligence or enhanced due diligence, and trying to understand deeply into what does it mean to Cummins if we will continue with that relationship. And on the other hand, what would be the risk if we're actually terminating? So I think it's really a fine balance between the two, really.
Yeah, these are, of course, the very difficult, sometimes can be very difficult situations, but ultimately comes down to the assessment of the risks, and also the business case. And oftentimes these situations are not as bad as you anticipated, because the business actually turns back and say, oh, actually, they're no longer aligned with our strategy, and yeah, we don't need to have them on board. So it really is case by case, but ultimately, in my experience, our business stakeholders are very good at listening to when the legal or compliance will articulate the real reasons, very well the reasons why this is not a good idea to continue, for example, and they will listen. And it doesn't need to be purely legalistic. It can be broader concepts, as you mentioned.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm recognising that I'm sort of sitting here between you and your well-deserved lunch or well-deserved email break, whichever way you want to look at it. But it would be great to see if there's any questions in the audience. There's been some really interesting insights, at least from my perspective, from the panel.
I hope I'm not gonna cut too much into our lunch break. Tom Finnick for Bayer again. We are currently running an in-house project where we are streamlining third-party oversight, and we realize there's 7 functions looking at the same target, from creditworthiness, IT security, integrity, compliance, quality, you name it. And I wonder, what is your experience bringing these functions together in terms of a consolidated risk assessment? Are you having an experience with the tool, which we are currently looking into, to really maneuver through the challenges jointly? And if so, are you operating with some kind of a scoring logic to ultimately determine whether you should partner with somebody or not?
Okay, well, I don't have an answer to that myself, so I think your question is focused around the cumbersome nature of trying to manage that process of having all of those different functions, trying to input into that integrated approach, basically. And certainly, I mean, working with other clients, I've certainly seen there is a lot of developing what I would see as workflow management tools out there that certainly obviously a lot of people are starting to use. But I don't know if any of the panelists have any particular experiences or insights they want to offer around that.
I think the hardest part is getting everyone in the same room. When we start on this kind of program with our clients, we try to get as many of the different stakeholders in one room at the start as possible, so that whatever the solution is designed with everyone's different agendas and risks in mind. It's not always the easiest thing to do, but I think the most successful programs are the ones we see where that has happened. It might not help you get them all in the same room, but if you've got some, senior leadership who can kind of trap them all in the same room together, I think that goes a huge way to developing a successful program.
I think we still on the same journey as you in terms of trying to consolidate all the risk and, as part of the compliant third-party compliance program. But I would say that we made a lot more progress in terms of addressing the risk with, sales and marketing team, and also financial control, where we see a lot more risk and mitigation plan in place with the money laundering and tax evasion. And so we started to integrate all those questions also as part of the due diligence process. And when we ask our third parties to provide us information for the due diligence. But, for example, with purchasing, managing suppliers, also that's a whole different thing where maybe we are exposed to different risks. For example, with the conflict mineral or modern slavery, human rights, etc. So the set of questions and the risk that we're experiencing on that space is different from the independent distributors or dealers. So we integrating with them differently and making sure that we also part of their approval in terms of appointing third-party suppliers and also reviewing the top suppliers annually. So yeah, we are part of that, but it's still a separate process at the moment.
Hi, we're also revamping our due diligence process in RB in our company to make it more proportional and comprehensive to the level of engagement intended by our business, considering the volume of all the third parties coming on boarding. Do you have any specific engagements or type of third parties that you consider to be out of scope for due diligence? If so, what was your approach to identify those that may sit within the company's risk tolerance?
So I think it's a really good question and is a related question, the one I asked earlier about this risk that as we expand our risk universe, as there becomes more pressure for greater level of enhanced diligence, that we end up with a very high benchmark being applied against an ever-increasing universe of third parties. I think and I'll let the panel answer from their experience, but I'm hopefully giving them some time to think as well. I think in terms of that approach of deciding where your risk tolerance is, I think the only thing that can ever be said is you need to be clear on the logic that you're applying to that decision making, and that you feel you can stand behind that within your organization because you understand that your organization better than anybody else. And you need to be able to write those principles down effectively. And it may be that there are factors that need to be expressed and you can't create very bright lines, but I think you can at least create guidance for your organization to say that as a general matter, this category of third parties will be outside because we don't see them as representing a level of risk that we feel we need to invest our finite amount of resource in. But here are some questions to ask yourself which may drag that third party into this universe. And that's certainly we've done a lot with clients when we've been thinking about their third party risk management frameworks to ask themselves that question, because there is always an easy answer just to say, well, just include them in the process, but it's not the right answer. There needs to be a way of drawing the lines, and you can do it. You just need to really ask yourself the questions about what risks you're trying to manage and apply that logic to get some conclusions about where you're willing to accept that risk. But a lot of that is just going to be driven by your corporate risk appetite, frankly, and you need to make some decisions about where you're going to set that. So that's my take on that question, but I don't know if others have other points to add.
I think I would echo that. I mean, we see clients trying to do the right thing and applying the same standard of due diligence to all their third parties. So an oil and gas client, and they are looking at the photographer who takes the pictures for their corporate brochure and their logistics company that moves their products across borders and interacts with customs. They're treating them as being on the same risk level, which, when I raise that with them, they realize actually that's ridiculous. So it starts with the risk assessment. It starts with deciding what your risk tolerance is. And I can't emphasize enough, write it down. Write down why you decided it. The number of conversations that I have with clients where they say, well, I'm comfortable with the risk. And I'm like, that's really nice. That's great. Show me how you got there. Where's the document that sits behind this? Because if you move on in 5 years or the regulator comes knocking, you just saying, oh, it's all right, I'm comfortable, isn't going to have much weight.
Agree with that. Any other questions?
Yep, we'll do one more and then we'll...
Do you think it's better to have a centralised red flag management approach or to leave it to the local businesses and local compliance people?
Yeah, I can answer that from our perspective. Certainly, we're moving towards the more as much standard approach globally as possible. So, whilst we have had a one tool in place for a while, there was a degree of discretion that was given to the local stakeholders to manage because they were deemed to be closer to the relationship, closer to the business. But we are very much moving towards making sure that we, as was mentioned a minute ago, having some objective factors that we can justify and we can apply them globally so that there is, a type of red flag will then result in a similar type of remediation approach. And we are consistent globally on that.
And I think just the last thing I'll say, and then I'll make sure I'm quiet, on that is just, of course, the tension that comes with that, and it's what we see with a lot of organisations that desire to bring more consistency centrally, is that you then have a tension about loss of responsibility and ownership locally. So there's always that need to manage that tension between those two things. I'm not suggesting that's the wrong approach, by the way. I'm just noting that there is always those inherent tensions you've got to be aware of as you make those decisions.
Excellent. Thank you very much.